Happy Monday to everybody. This is the Backseat Economist here. Going to be the back porch economist today. I want to try and get a little sunshine, but it seems the moment I came out here, the sun went away. So we wanted to make a two-part series on the recent World Economic Forum speech that Janet Yellen did on, I believe it was Wednesday. And these types of speeches are done once a year. The World Economic Forum is a pretty big event for the world's biggest economies. Janet Yellen is our Treasury Secretary, formerly our Fed Reserve Chairman. So whatever she has to say is probably going to be heavily predicated on what's going to actually happen. And it's also very important to at least for me, but for everybody, to focus on what she says and what she believes is happening with our economy in the moment, and not just in the future. So the two-part video is going to be one part on what she believes is happening at the moment and kind of my own analysis on that, and then what she believes is going to be occurring in the future. And of course, she's no longer a Fed chairman. She's now a part of Joe Biden's cabinet, so she has to be pretty optimistic. She's got to be pretty rosy. Her job is different now. She's not independent. She's not an independent non-governmental organization. Now she's obviously directly employed by the executive branch. So kind of her job to put a nice spin on things. And she did a good job at doing that. She definitely put a positive spin on where the economy currently is at. That's what this video is going to be mostly about here, where the economy is mostly at. And then, like I said, my next part will be where she believes it's going to go. There's actually, and I'll probably time it up with that video, there's a video or there's a speech, Fed speech on Wednesday to most likely announce the tightening of the money supply, and is probably going to encourage market interest rates to raise. So I will probably await for that announcement to make my next video on the future, as obviously that has a big impact on the future. So one of the very positive aspects of Yellen's speech was the fact that she believes the economy has superseded expectations up to this point. And she points to a couple different metrics to kind of back that claim. I think the average person would probably disagree that our economy has superseded any expectations, but I also think that maybe it's kind of tough to know what to expect in the current climate, right? So I think most of us probably have no idea what to expect, and therefore can't really think of a very clear path for our economy to follow between the pandemic and the different constant global stressors. It's very hard to keep track of, right? So, but one of the big metrics that she pointed to was the growth of our GDP, which was measured at 5%, 5.3%. And that's a pretty solid growth. I think the kind of hit target that most economists would like to see is around 3.5% average annual growth. So this would place us above that. But the question is, how did we get to that annual growth? How did we get to that GDP calculation? So they tout that number out there, but they don't really explain how that number and what went into that number to get us that. And that's very important, because how we got that growth is very important. It's the different measurements that go into calculating that number. It's important where our GDP is being driven from. If it's being driven from consumer consumption, typically that's a good thing. It means people are out here consuming and buying, and our products, American products, are in high demand, and people have the money to spend on those products. Our consumption levels are usually the main driver of our GDP growth, but it's not the only one. And the one I want to talk about is the government expenditures, right? So that also goes into the calculation, and the government expenditure levels, I'm sure as you can guess, has been really high, and that is a concern, obviously, for I think pretty much anyone who is familiar with basic economics. Government expenditure levels that are too high would kind of bring in a false. It kind of makes for a false bullish market where, as things have been, it would appear that there's an over. How do I put this? There's an overabundance of money in the system, and it's not stemming from product consumption or from manufacturing or services, but from the government stepping into the economy itself and making direct purchases. And that's probably the most unappealing way for us to get a higher growth, right? And so that's what's happening. We are at a 35.81% government expenditures share of that GDP, meaning 35.81% of the GDP growth was due to government expenditures. It's not a terrible thing, but it's not a great thing either. It's typically looked at as a unwanted way of growing, but it is a way of growing, and that's why the Treasury Department is willing to tout it as such. What you really want to look at, and what I always look at, is not necessarily the consumption, either consumer or government consumption, but the import to export ratio, because that is a telltale sign of what our economy as a whole is producing for the rest of the world and for ourselves. And that ratio will kind of tell you whether or not the consumption is backed up by the goods and services. If it's just money being spent in the economy to put towards social welfare programs, or which we know it has been, right? To put towards COVID stimuluses and stuff like that. There's no actual goods and services being provided other than the money itself. And so in the long run, that's not usually a good thing for an economy, because there's no actual production happening. There's no long-term growth strategy. It's a very short-run infuse of cash that has very short-run consequences. So as you can imagine, the import-export ratio has actually, the deficit has grown. The Treasury Department's not going to tell you that, because that's not a good look for them. It's kind of difficult for them to tout the growth of the economy, but then speak on the import-export deficit growing. And what I mean by growing is we are importing at a much higher ratio goods and services than we are exporting, and mainly goods. We are actually a net surplus exporter of services, but we have been in a deficit of goods import exports for a really long time, and it's been a problem. And you see that in your everyday life with the closing of manufacturing and the wide closing of industrial components. You see factories moving across to Asia and Hispanic countries, and so it's no surprise that the industrial component of our country has been shrinking. But what that tells you is that the actual growth that our economy experienced was due more to the consumption by the government that wasn't backed up by goods and services, which is a very short run infuse of production. It's not real production at all. It's literally just handing out money, and not backed up by the actual creation of products therefore the creation of jobs and the payment of wages, right? So that's a big key. That's a big thing to look at when you're talking about these numbers here. And I say, don't take my word for it. This is all public knowledge. You can look all this information up. It's calculated every quarter. And what you'll actually end up seeing is that the previous months to the last calculation, which was in November, it would actually show that we were closing the import-export deficit. So it was showing basically that our ratio of exporting was catching up to what we were importing, meaning we were closing that deficit. We were actually starting to export more goods than what we were importing. And on the surface, that looks like a great thing. And it would be a great thing if it was actually true. But what was happening really was that the backlog in our supply chains was making it such that those actual goods that were being imported just weren't having been counted yet. The backlog was making it look like we were importing less and that we were closing that gap, but we really weren't. We just weren't counting a lot of the goods that were stuck in our ports and haven't made their way through yet. So you'll start to see that deficit grow again, and in November it surely did. In February you'll see another quarterly report, and there's monthly reports as well, and you can see that the deficit has continued to grow. And year to date in November, just November 2020 to November 2021, there was a 28% rise in the deficit. So even though those last few months there looked promising, it was literally just because of the supply backlog. So not great. Not great. She can tout it as much as she'd like as a feather in the administration's cap, but when you really peel back the numbers, it's not a great thing. She also talked about the unemployment rate, and we have a low unemployment rate right now. It's hovering around 3.9%. Again, on the surface, that looks great. But when you peel back the numbers on that, and a lot of people don't actually know this, but the unemployment rate is only calculated from a group of people who actually participate in the labor market. So it's not a raw number of all of the working eligible adults in this country. Of that, you would think on the surface, okay, well, how many of the working eligible adults are actually working? Well, there's the unemployment ratio, and that's not the case. They actually take, of the eligible people to work, they take the group of people who are quote unquote actually looking for work, and they dismiss what they call discouraged workers. So people who are dropped out of the labor market altogether. They're no longer searching for work, and therefore they're not to be counted in the unemployment number. From this number, they derive what's called the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate is giving you the ratio of actual, not only working eligible adults, but those who are still willing to look for and get gainfully employed. And that number is at an all-time low. 61.9% of our labor force is actually participating in the labor force. So when you talk about a low unemployment, you have to recognize that it's a low unemployment, but it's also a low overall aggregate number of people looking and willing to work right now. So the less people obviously looking for work and willing to work and looking to work, obviously the lower amount of people who are then out of that number actually out of work, right? If that's how you're going to count it. Obviously, I have an issue with them counting it like that, but that's how they're going to count it, and therefore they are able to say, hey, 3.9%, things are looking good, even though we know they're not, right? I mean, we all have eyes. We can see that things aren't looking great as far as the labor force goes, and the only thing I think at this point to pull us out would be a massive wage increase throughout all markets. So I'm looking at my new video to focus on what she started describing as the things that would continue to be implemented and were implemented to pick up growth. And there were several things that she touched on, some interesting things, and she kind of redefined what supply side economics was. In the classical sense, it is essentially massive deregulation and tax cuts for those that create jobs, quote unquote, trickle down economics, essentially swinging the supply curve to the right of the labor force and allowing the people who create jobs to do so, to reinvest in jobs, and to allow the economy to move forward. Her new form of supply side economics is essentially a kind of longer term view, a investment in human capital in a way, an investment in infrastructure, and addressing kind of the long term negative side effects also, like the environmental damage that capitalism can kind of wreak, which, you know, I'm about as pure capitalist as I come, but even I recognize that there can be widespread environmental damage from capitalism if left unchecked. So, not a total hater of what she was saying, and I actually have a pretty rosy view of what some of these policies could do. So I'm going to wait till Wednesday to hear a little more of a firmer angle on where they're going to go with the rate increases. And I'd love to hear back from you all as far as what you think about the current state of the economy and some of the numbers she touted here, and whether you feel they are realistic and hit home for you or not. So until then, I hope everybody continues to stay warm out here. It's getting colder here in Maryland, I know that. Got to re-up on the home heating oil, which is probably about $150 more expensive, from about $350 for 150 gallons to about $530 for the heating tank to be resupplied. So yeah, it's getting colder, and it's getting more expensive, but we will persevere. Hope everybody has a good day here, and see you next time.